Okay, fine.
Kick it off.
Okay. Hi guys, what's up? My name is Dr. Caroline Fenkel. I am here to talk to you guys a little bit about drug trends and vaping in youth. Really excited for those of you who are here today and excited for those of you who are live streaming. I know. How many people do we have live streaming? Do you have a count?
Currently 7.
7 people. Hello to those 7 people in your homes. All right, so let's first just start a little bit about talking about addiction and what sort of that looks like, especially talking about the adolescent brain and how incredibly fragile the adolescent brain is because it's currently in the middle of developing. And so what we know is that 1 in 4 Americans who begin using any substance before the age of 18 can develop an addiction, whereas 1 in 25 Americans who begin using any addictive substance after the age of 21 become addicted. So I think that this is just a really powerful statistic that speaks to this idea that the longer that you can keep your teen away from any type of an addictive substance, the better off that they are throughout their lives. And I think that that's what we do a lot at Center for Families, which is where I work. So I'm the executive director at a program called Center for Families, which is an adolescent day therapeutic program. And I see a lot of teenagers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about them and what we see in their trends, because we have 30 students currently that come to us all throughout the day with diagnoses such as substance use disorder, anxiety, depression, anorexia, bulimia, those types of things that the kids are struggling with. So I'll be able to use them as some examples about what it is that they're talking about struggling with. So when we're talking about the adolescent brain, we're doing a lot of talking about this idea that the cake isn't fully baked yet, if you will. You guys know what I'm saying? This idea that not all things are necessarily firing at the same time, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about with the developing brain. So first and foremost, with physical coordination, their cerebellum, we know that in this region of the brain that it's really important for physical activity, coordination, interest in recreational activities, and we know that kids are oftentimes really all about sports, or all about running around, or all about this idea of sort of trying to exercise, get out, and they oftentimes have a lot of energy, and that's where this idea of the cerebellum being a little bit more activated in adolescent has to do with. Then we've got the amygdala with the emotions, the teenager emotions of what everybody likes to always talk about, and this idea that essentially teenagers can be really passionate, but at the same time they can also be overreactive, and struggle with sort of expressing their own emotions because they tend to have a lot of them. And that is, again, just a trait of the developing brain in adolescence. Then we're dealing with the nucleus accumbens, which essentially is looking at the motivation. And what we know is that there are teens who are highly motivated, and then there are teens which can look like this idea of being impulsive, right? Like, I want to do it and I want to do it right now. I don't know if you guys can relate to that idea, but I want to do it and I want to do it right now, right? And so their motivation for this idea of having something and making it happen right away and instant gratification is usually really high. Parents don't think of their teenagers as being really motivated because of the fact that, like, oftentimes they're like, no, I don't feel like it. Or they're like watching Netflix in bed and they're just like, oh, you're not motivated, you're lazy. But in reality, they actually can't, like, we know that this part of their brain is overactive during this time. But we also know that it's more of an impulsive thing, which brings us to the next part, which is the prefrontal cortex, which is probably where the most amount of thought really takes place. And we know that this is the most underdeveloped part of teenagers' brains. So this is a place of judgment. And so it essentially controls reasoning, impulses, and is responsible for executive functioning, such as decision making. And it's not fully developed until they're about 25. So this is the real kind of meat of why it is that teenagers using substances at such young ages can oftentimes lead to big problems, because what happens is substance use can kind of, if you will, slow down these parts, right? It can stunt the growth of them and the development of them. And that's where the sort of fear comes in. Furthermore, if they are experimenting with substances, the fact that they are impulsive and struggle with decision making, so those two parts of their brains can oftentimes lead to pretty disastrous consequences where they decide to get into the car and drive if they're drunk, et cetera.
Sure, absolutely. And just real quick, I just want to introduce myself as well. My name is Sean Rogers. I work with Caroline. It's a pleasure working at Center for Cannabis, as well as Caroline. And one of the things that Caroline just mentioned too is that, when they're going through this phase, this part of the tough phase of their life, when we're talking about this part of the brain that's not fully developed just yet. One of the issues is that they can utilize these things such as nicotine or any other substances as a coping mechanism as well, because they're now programming their brain that, something goes wrong, I need to take a hit of this vape, or something goes wrong, I need to go smoke something, or something goes wrong, I need to take something. So it's imperative that we're not only educating yourself, but we're educating our teams that these are all risk factors, major risk factors moving forward when it comes to the cake not being fully baked.
Okay, so this explains a lot of these effects, right? So we know that they have difficulty holding back or controlling emotions. And like what Sean said, this idea that they have a big emotions, right? That their emotions are much bigger. I don't know if you guys can imagine being a teenager, but what it felt like to have like your first love break up with you, like what that feeling was like. And these were big, big feelings. And oftentimes teenagers look at substances to try and help those feelings. Whereas if they were not using substances, they could use other parts of their brains to cope with it. Okay, so a preference for physical activity. We know that we've seen that in teenagers. A preference for high excitement and low effort activities. So this looks like video games, sex, music, substance use, anything that can basically get them to feel feelings without having to do a ton of effort is a big part of sort of this idea of going through teenage years, right? And that's that instant gratification that we were talking a little bit about, wanting things and wanting them right now. And then we also see this idea of poor planning, judgment. They're rarely ever thinking of negative consequences. Oftentimes teenagers, like I remember being a kid and I would go to like my friend's house and be like, I have no idea how I'm gonna get home. No clue, right? Like never set up a ride home, never thought about a ride home. The thought was just like, I wanna go over to my friend's house and that's it, right? And so that is just simply the cake not being baked. That's just simply my prefrontal cortex is just not working the way that it should be working, right? And same thing would happen with school, right? Where you have a test that's on Friday and it's Monday and you just like never really thought like, I should probably be studying for this test for the next 5 days, right? Like the thought literally never surfaced. And that's, I think, what's really hard is that I think that oftentimes parents think that the thought came up and they're like, no, I'm not gonna study for that test. Like, nope, the thought never surfaced to study for the test because their prefrontal cortex is just not working. Does that make sense? And guys, by the way, feel free to ask questions, jump in anytime. I'm not sure how it will work with the live streaming situation. It will be fine. Okay, but feel free to raise your hand, ask questions at any point in time. I want this to be conversational, which is also why I wanted to bring Sean up. Okay, so also we're looking at more risky impulsive behaviors, and looking at this idea of experimenting with drugs and alcohol. And that does not mean that every kid who experiments with drugs or alcohol is going to become addicted. We're going to talk more about that, especially at the end, about sort of, what do I really look for signs if I need my kid to get help. All right, so let's talk about vaping. How many of your kids vape? Okay, all right. How many of you vape? No one? Okay. So I have found that there are some parents who either smoke or vape and, the kids are vaping and it becomes a sort of a never-ending cycle, if you will. All right. What do we know about vapes? Very little, right? We know very little about their effects as evidenced by what happened with the kid gasping for breath idea that started to come out, and these people really struggling with vaping-induced illnesses and lung conditions. But what we do know about them, I'm going to try and deliver to you guys tonight, and then talk a little bit about how to help teens to get out of this. So, vaporizers, vape pens, hookah pens, electronic cigarettes, all of them are essentially an electronic nicotine delivery system. That's it. The idea of vapes and when they came out was to help people to get off of cigarettes. So somebody is smoking a pack a day, here, take this vape, you can go down to 4 cigarettes a day, and then down to 3, and then down to 2, and then down to 1, and you can now be vaping, and now you can go off of your vape. And there were, back then, what would happen is you would have milligrams of nicotine, and you would go down in milligrams of nicotine. I had a lot of friends that quit smoking through vaping, and they would, essentially go down to 0, where they were just like smoking the flavor of it. But what we have seen is that no longer is this really a harm reduction tactic. We are just seeing skyrockets of, just rates of just incredibly high numbers of kids vaping. I can tell you that at Center for Families, I would say at least 80% of the kids that we treat have vaped once. And I would say that at least 50% of them are like addicted to vaping, and we'll talk about that. And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like day to day for them, because it's hard, which is really kind of what I want to talk a little bit more about. So, used to ingest vaporized liquid, nicotine. You could also put THC liquid in it as well, which we'll talk about, flavorings or combination. And it's often referred to as Jouling due to the popularity of the Joule device, and it can be introducing, teens to nicotine at alarming rates. And part of that is, when I would want to smoke a cigarette, you would have to leave school, and you would have to go and find a spot. You would have to get a lighter, which is not always easy to find a lighter. You would need to find a spot that people aren't going to be able to smell it. And then you would come back in, and everybody would smell it and would know that you were smoking, and you would very easily get caught. And because of all of those steps that you would have to take, right? First step is to find somebody who has cigarettes. Second step is to make sure that you got a lighter. Third step is to find a place where they're going to be able, where nobody's going to be able to see you. Fourth step is to put spray all over you. That these are the reasons why people would not smoke. They would be like, you know what? Sounds like too big of a problem for me, right? I'm just not even going to go there. All right. Now with vapes, it's like a whole new world, right? Because literally they can take a puff of their vape and you hold it in for so long that when you go out, they call it ghosting. When you exhale, you can't see it. So a lot of times people vape, they inhale, right? And then they exhale, and you can see the vape come out. You can see this kind of cloud of vape come out. But kids can ghost it, which means that essentially they're holding into their lungs these horrible, which we're going to talk a little bit about what's in these, right? But they're holding into their lungs, and then when they exhale, you can't see it or smell it. So there's that, number one. Number two is you can do it anytime, anywhere. You can't smell it. It's impossible to see. It's impossible to smell. And it's essentially just the easiest way to get nicotine into your system or marijuana. And it's quick, and it's available everywhere. And thus, it has created a pretty big problem with our teenagers.
Yeah, and absolutely. And the other thing, too, is it's unregulated. So we don't know what each and every teen is being exposed to when it comes to different pods, different juices, different flavors. There was a big win last week, and I say win just because we're trying to narrow the use of it and the regulatory effects of it, is that a bill was just passed to remove a lot of the flavorings off the shelves. So, a kid innocently, and I say a teen, is smoking something that tastes like bubble gum, and they don't really see the harms or the effects or the road this could lead to. In our position, and everybody's position, not just our position, it's our job to really educate and inform them that a lot of the things we're about to talk about is the exposure, the risk factors, and what this means for this individual, going down that road. And again, like Caroline said in the beginning, Doesn't mean every kid that's going to smoke a vape is going to be addicted to things, but the individuals that maybe are pre-exposed, this could be a very bad path for them to be introduced to.
Yeah. So just to kind of jump off of what Sean's talking about, I skipped ahead a little bit, but these are some of the reasons why kids list that they vape. So, the number one reason is to experiment, to see what it's like. Number two, because it tastes good. And that's what Sean's talking about, is this idea of bubblegum, of cherry. And, I have a whole slide about that kind of stuff, which I'll get to later. Okay. Basically a big part of this is this idea of to have a good time with my friends. I have reports of kids all the time just talking about going to their friend's house, being in the basement, going on TikTok, and just like vaping, but passing a vape between each other, that's like their fun way of passing time, which again, like, when we talk about this idea of like what we did as teenagers when we were having fun, right? It could have been that you went to a party and drank. It could have been that you went and smoked cigarettes. But again, like drinking, smoking cigarettes, even smoking pot, people could see it. There was a trace of it. And they weren't everywhere all the time, right? It was only ever really, advertised, especially in Pennsylvania. We don't have it at Wawa. We don't have alcohol at Wawa. So you weren't really exposed to these kinds of things that necessarily the way that you're exposed to, that these kids are exposed to vapes, and it's so much easier. So go ahead, please.
So the flavors don't even have a smell of the vape?
Yes, so the flavors do have a smell. It's faint. So, for example, when kids go into the bathroom and vape at Center for Families, they will tell me that it is a air freshener that's in the bathroom, right? So it can smell like an air freshener, but here's the deal. There's, when you smell weed, you know what the smell of weed is, right? When you smell, alcohol, you know what that smell is, like what beer smells like. With this, it could be mango or it could be mint or it could be, bubble gum, or it could be this, or it could be that. So it's like very difficult to tell. And on top of that, if you do, vape and blow it out the window, it's so faint. I mean, you can't smell it.
So the THC vape doesn't smell like weed?
It does.
Well,
It does.
and that's not always true either, and I don't mean to
Some do,
contradict you,
some
but
don't.
but there are a lot of odorless THC pods as well, and unfortunately I know that from an experience I had with a sibling who's in college, and he was home for Christmas, and I'm like, what's that? And he blew it out, and it didn't smell at all. It didn't smell like anything, but it was odorless THC. So, I just share that because my mind was blown. I was like, oh my God, this doesn't smell like anything at all. If I did that at my parents' house, I probably would have been belled off and beat when I was a kid, but my little brother was sitting there doing it on the couch. So my point to that too, and to back up to your initial question is, we have to remember this is all these chemicals are being vaporized. So when they come back out, you're not smelling a lot of the concentrate because it's already been inhaled in the individual. So, but it is so faint, you know what I mean? And to Caroline's point, if you smell bubble gum on your teen's breath, you're not going to question anything, right? So it's really hard to tell sometimes as parents.
All right, so to relax or relieve tension, this increased more than a third from 2018. To feel good or feel high also increased significantly from 2018. Because of boredom, nothing else to do, I get that a lot. Because it looks cool, I don't get that much from kids, but because I'm hooked and I have to have it, that would be the majority of the teenagers that we treat at Center for Families. They really are hooked. They really want to have it. And this is the part that I really want to make clear to you guys. The kids that I talk to that are vaping, and I'm talking about kids that even might not vape that much, they don't like it. Like, how when you talk to cigarette smokers, they're like, oh, I hate that I smoke. It's the worst, right? Teens are actually very similar because what I do with them is I'll be like, let's talk about the moment where you run out of pods. Like, what happens? And they're like, oh, that's the worst feeling ever when I run out of pods. Like, it's horrible. I don't know what I'm going to do for the next several hours, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, like, it kind of sucks to be addicted to, like, nicotine and these, like, vapes, isn't it? And they're like, yeah, it's kind of the worst. Like, I wish that I had never started. That's, like, the big thing, right? I wish that I had never started. And that's what they say. And they have, like, insight into this idea that they're sort of, like, slaves to these devices that look like USB ports, you know, and they don't really know necessarily what to do or how to help themselves, because they know that if they admit it to their parents or they admit it to other people that they're going to try and get them help, but then there's parts of them that doesn't want to stop because they like it, right? And there's parts of them that does want to stop. But I would say that when you start to really hone in on the amount of pain that they're in when they start to run out, you tend to start to see how they really are not happy that they're doing this.
Yeah, and also just like any real addiction, it starts out with just an experiment or a curiosity piece or acceptance from my peers, you know, and then kind of quickly can go down that line of, you know, the need or the want, or I have to have this because I'm so stressed out about this exam, and if I don't have this, it's the end of the world. But that goes back to the part where you presented about the brain and that judgment zone and all these emotions that are not being dealt with, but the teen or young adult thinks that, like, you know, this will fix it. Or they really do feel as though that fixes it. So, you know, it's tough, but, you know, we have to continue to educate and inform individuals about these things.
So it's interesting that the least one is to help me quit regular cigarettes, and this idea that it's, you know, what is it? It's less than 10%. So the original idea of vapes was to help people quit cigarettes, but we know that with teens in particular, they never were smoking cigarettes, so now they just started vaping, and, you know, cigarettes never came into their lives necessarily.
And look at the increase from 8th grade to 12th grade.
Yeah, so I think that, so one of the things that I think is also really important is to note this idea that because I'm hooked, I have to have it, more than doubled from 2018. So this idea that, like, the kids that I'm talking about, there's a lot more of them out there that are really struggling with being on this stuff. But yeah, so you know, the idea of this, because regular cigarette use is not permitted, that's like what I'm talking about with the number of steps that it would take to go and sneak a cigarette while you're at school, as opposed to literally going into the bathroom, quick vaping, putting it back in your pocket and leaving. Like, please.
Yeah.
Where are the numbers coming from? Is this kids that you're surveying that are coming through Center for Families?
No.
Oh, no, this is a national
This is from
survey
right
that
here.
we've utilized some data from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's right here. Trends in Adolescent Vaping, 2017 to 2019.
Yeah.
It's the New England Journal of Medicine.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's talk a little bit about how teens get vapes. So this is a question that comes up on the websites that they buy it from. Yes or no? That's interesting. A friend or relative is usually the first place in which they get it from. Local vape shops and gas stations, especially mom and pop gas stations that will, you know, sell these kinds of things. You know, Wawa makes you take out your license and they scan your license. Online vendors sell vape devices as well. Underage youth may get a Visa gift card or use PayPal. I have a lot of teens that use PayPal. You can just, like, apparently set up a PayPal account.
Or you can have the password to your parents' PayPal, apparently, because we just had a teen that was very smart and ordered a bunch of stuff from China. So, you know, it happens. They sound like crazy stories, but they do happen.
These are true things.
Yeah, so if you see some random charge on your PayPal account, you might want to question that.
Or if you see a random package show up. So this happens a lot. Teenagers get packages delivered. They're the first ones home from school. They grab the package, they bring it up to their room, they get rid of it. And that's their vape device that they have used. And they've used grandmom's Visa gift card that she gave them for Christmas to buy it. All right, so why do kids decide to use e-cigarettes or vape? So one is that it's used by a friend or a family member. I have found that this to be very true in that I have 13 nieces and nephews, and I have, you know, an older nephew who goes to Syracuse, and he's at our shore house vaping, you know. And then you've got, like, these little kids that are in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, and they're seeing their cool nephew vaping, you know. So these are the kinds of things that you guys have to look out for. That if there are cousins that are hanging out with one another, if you are vaping, or if you know, a sibling of yours or anybody else, like, just to try and make sure not for them to see it, because modeling behavior is one of the most important things, right, when it comes to parents. that it's really important that you guys model behavior. And I will tell you that when you tell a teen, like, you need to stop vaping, you know, and then they look right back at you and are like, well, you need to stop drinking, right? It becomes very real for parents.
Yeah.
And oftentimes, you know, teenagers will turn things around real quick and say, you know, you drink a glass of wine, I vape, what's the big deal, you know? And it's just important to make sure that you have your own stuff in check before you start to ask them things, because they continually will do things like that, you know? And it's important that we model behavior that's responsible and, you know, yeah.
Yeah, and I think the hope with giving this presentation is that really educating and inform everybody in the room so that when these conversations do come up, these facts are pertinent to the conversation. Well, why do I need to stop vaping? Well, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about the fact that you are being exposed to things that could be very harmful to you down the line. And, you know, like, no teen's going to really want to hear that, but having an open dialogue of a conversation and letting them know that you care about their health long term, not just right now because their friends think it's cool, but rather, like, what is in that? You know, we found out that we ask a lot of teens, like, what is in what you have? They don't even know. You know what I mean? They order it because it was cool. Their friend told them about it, and they wanted this, spearmint flavored pen that they saw on some website. So I think a lot of the education and information goes out the window when it comes to acceptance and fitting in certain circles. I always say this, like, the hardest time in their life to really find their identity, right? So it's important that we let them know that they're heard and that we can have a conversation, that it's not the end of the world, but, like, let's talk about this. And like, let's talk about it in a sense where, you know, we care about you. You know what I mean?
All right, so and I think, by the way, we're going to talk a little bit more about this idea of, you know, why stop, right? Because there are some dangers to this. Availability of flavors such as mint, candy, fruit, or chocolate is number 2. And number 3 is they believe it is less harmful than other forms of tobacco. This is what I get nonstop.
Yep.
Well, Caroline, tobacco, it's better than me smoking a cigarette. Turns out that it's not.
Nope.
It's funny, I went to a wedding recently and I was sat next to a pulmonologist, really smart guy. And I said, all right, you know, let's open up the bag, right? Tell me about vaping. And he's like, isn't it so crazy that people would think that inhaling any substance other than oxygen would somehow be okay over long periods of time, like that would be okay to put inside of your very fragile lungs, which are one cell. I mean, the pockets that the oxygen goes into your lungs is one cell thick. Like, they are fragile. They are just one cell when each of them open up and pull in this oxygen. And he said, look, is it better? Which one is better? He's like, that depends. He's like, do you want to die after 30 years of smoking cigarettes in a long, painful, slow death? Or do you want to take the risk that you're going to quickly die gasping for breath with the thousands of people that are dying from this lung disease that people are getting through these vaping? Like, you decide. You want to die at 17 or you want to die when you're 80 and can't breathe, or 70, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I thought that was like a really good way to sort of put this into perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, so part of my role at Center for Families is I go out to a lot of these presentations and, I have the opportunity to listen to many different presenters. And recently there was a presenter that presented for Be a Part of the Conversation. And the gentleman was a doctor, and he spoke about the fact that, you know, this is such a misnomer. It's such false information, because at least cigarettes, and now, again, he's saying that cigarettes are not healthy, but at least they're regulated. At least we know exactly what's on them, the ingredients are in the pack. Whereas when you're talking about juices, pods, anything that you're vaporizing at 500 degrees and putting in your lungs, and you have no idea, you are really running a huge risk when it comes to any health issues for any type of lung condition, heart issues. So, and we just recently saw that, there was a big media bump in, some of the individuals, an individual locally that had a complete episode from vaping. And, we're starting to see some of those effects of this unregulated industry with juices and pods and so on and so forth. So regulated to unregulated, they're both unhealthy, but it is definitely not more healthy. And we hear that from teens, at least I'm not smoking. Well, we're happy, we're glad that you're not smoking, but the fact is
But, like,
like,
were
this
you
is no
ever
safer. Yeah, well, that's another thing too.
Were you ever smoking cigarettes?
Yeah,
though?
yeah.
Yeah, I think that
Teens
that's...
are great debaters though. We all know that.
So just a quick segue on this Joule idea. I think that a lot of parents aren't necessarily sure about what Joules are, but this is what a Joule looks like. You charge it through a USB port. I've had many parents find wires in their rooms, 2 wires taken out of any kind of a charger, and if you take these 2 wires and you put them onto the bottom of the Joule, you can actually charge a Joule. Does that make sense? Like any wire, you could just use the negative and positive and charge it. It's pretty impressive that some kid figured that out, I think.
Yeah.
But that's a big thing, like when they can't find their chargers, they'll oftentimes do that. So I'll say to parents like, oh, have you ever found any wires? And they'll be like, oh my God, I keep on finding these wires places. I don't know why.
I also think it's interesting to mention too, with Joule as a company, and this is kind of a side note, fastest growing company in the United States in 2019, and like went from like $1 million company to like $1 billion company overnight. And the reason being is that they market it to their consumers directly with the flavors. I mean, we always go back to this idea of like, it doesn't smell bad, it doesn't taste bad. Who are we really marketing to? We're marketing to teens and young adults, and they blew up as a direct result of direct consumer marketing.
So with the 5% nicotine per unit, which are the cartridges that most people buy, there's also a 2.5% one. But with the 5%, essentially 1 Joule cartridge or pod is the equivalent of 1 pack of cigarettes or 200 puffs. I treat teens that have gone through like a cartridge a day, which is a pack a day. I mean, that's a lot. It looks so little, right? It looks like such a small amount of oil, but that's a lot to put into your lungs.
Can you address like the atomization of like why they're so much more dangerous
From
today versus like the molecular size of cigarette smoke versus particle size of cigarette smoke versus the molecular size of atomized is approximately like 30 times smaller than the cigarette. So it's even deeper along with each puff, with each inhale, with the ghost, because the liquid or the atomization of oil gets that much deeper in their lungs, that's what's increasing apparently there. I was interested to see if you were going to shift that.
Yeah, so we don't really address that on this slide deck. This is more educational and informational from the standpoint of like,
but you
what
just
we need
addressed
to.
it.
Yeah, I mean, you just did a great job. Can you come to our next presentation?
Yeah, you can come
No,
on
but
up.
to your point, that's what that individual, that's what that teenager had the episode with down at CHOP with the aspirations, because it was, the doctor said it, and you said it very well, it was much deeper in his lungs, and they caught it much later because of the fact that it was a much smaller episode than a typical when they go in and do scans for any type of tobacco use. So very well stated, very well said, and certainly this is what we're talking about when the non-regulation and the fact that a 14-year-old doesn't know anything. I barely know what you just said, but a 14-year-old certainly doesn't know what you just said, right? So they don't understand the harmful risks that we're discussing, and I think that this stuff is really good, educating and informing parents of districts, but then we need to take it to the youth, because that's kind of the swing that big tobacco went. And Caroline's going to show a really interesting slide, I don't know if you did already, of the marijuana to tobacco rise and fall. But basically, when we started to educate and inform our youth about their decision-making process around tobacco in 1998, that's when we started to see the decline. And that's kind of, I think that's the direction we're moving in with vaping as well. So, yeah, so here's the slide, right? So 1998, we started, that's when the big lawsuit came down from big tobacco. They had to pay for educational and informational sessions in school systems. We started to educate and inform our teens in regards to their use decisions and empower their decision-making process, and we saw it decline pretty steadily. Marijuana, interestingly enough, and I don't want to take over the presentation, this is yours, but has kind of inclined a little bit over the years. And that's a whole nother conversation for another day. But it does tie into this conversation with THC pods and like we were talking about earlier, like the ease of access and ease of use for teens with odorless THC and other forms through vaporizing.
Is there any such thing as a flavored
Not pod necessarily, but juice, right?
So actually there are just straight tobacco pods that are not flavors. They taste like a cigarette would.
Oh, wait, are
right?
you saying with no nicotine?
Yeah, I would say like what they used originally to get people off of referencing the vegan.
Yeah, like, could my kid think, well, there's no nicotine in this, it's just bubblegum flavor, I'm not getting it.
Oh,
Yes.
Oh, yes.
That is a thing.
Yeah,
I
that is
don't
a
think
thing.
that they make it in pods necessarily. Right.
No. Yeah. So
Maybe
those
they
are
do make
those are the big vaporizing. You ever see like they almost look like a remote control people carry
Yes.
around?
This one right
Yes.
here.
So then they would fill that glass piece up at the top with the juice that doesn't have nicotine in it. But yes, there are. But that
Like
is
Joule does not make it.
Yeah, but that is the one thing that is being removed from the market is they're taking all these juices off because this still affects the lung in a negative way, regardless of nicotine and addiction or not.
And then what's the cost, you said the one, whatever, is about the cost, is about the nicotine in a pack of cigarettes?
Yeah.
What does that cost compared to a pack of cigarettes? Because I remember like, when I was in my 20s, a lot of my friends quit smoking because it was just getting too expensive.
Sure. So this is one thing that's interesting with Joule is Joule started off with the cost being like very cheap for pods. You could get like 4 or 8 of them for like $10 or $15, and then they slowly increased their cost of pods.
As people got addicted.
Yeah, and what happened was
So
they became much closer to a pack of cigarettes, but cigarettes have got, I'm sorry? It's still cheaper. It's still cheaper because cigarettes continue to climb. I mean, we're almost at $9 a pack of cigarettes in the state of Pennsylvania. But pods started out at like $2.50 per, and now they're at like $4.50 or $5 per. I can't keep up, but it keeps going up.
I think that for 4 pods, it's $20.
Yeah. So there you go, $5 a piece.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay, we went through this. All right, so this is what we're already kind of have talked about. I don't know how much longer we need to put on this, but is this an e-liquid or is this a food product, right? That's what food products look like up there, right? It kind of looks similar. Like, look at this. Fruit Loops, Apple Snacks, vape flakes. So these are all things that are really like, kind of as really marketed to teenagers.
And here's the interesting.
Marketed to kids.
You're not allowed to buy this until you're, 18 or 21?
Yeah.
Do you think they're marketing to an 18 or 21-year-old here? No.
What is this dude doing?
I have no idea. Where'd you get that?
Captain Crunch. All right, so this is kind of this idea of what you were talking about, which we're going to hit a little bit, but we're not going to talk about particle size, but I can now incorporate that. But I think that the big thing about this idea is that we are dealing with this idea of like ultrafine particles that can be inhaled deep, deep into the lungs. And, the idea behind that is if you smoke a cigarette, like when you smoke a cigarette, it kind of burns a little bit in the back of your throat and you don't want to necessarily inhale a lot, right? And that's because it's hot, but it's also because it's smoke, right? It's carcinogen. So it's like it does not feel good in your lungs. When you vape, like when you take a hit of a vape, it's as if you're like inhaling oxygen. So you can so much easier like inhale all the way down and do what I was talking about, which is the ghosting. And this is like, it can go all the way down into your lungs.
Yeah.
And it's really scary. The scariest thing that goes down into your lungs, aside from the vitamin E acetate, which is what they linked all the vaping stuff to, is this idea, the heavy metals. So they found nickel, tin, and lead inside of these vape juices. And remember, these vape juices are, and I have to like remind my teenagers this, are made by like children in basements in China. That's where they're being made, right? And like there is no science. There are no, Jesse Pinkman probably made better meth on Breaking Bad than these kids are making of these vapes. Like they just are putting stuff in there that we don't actually know what it is, especially when you have teenagers that are super impulsive, have poor judgment, and then decide to buy a super cheap pod, right? Like an off-market black label pod, or are vaping THC. Like the THC stuff is also obviously not regulated. So these are the kinds of things that really kind of worry us around this.
Yeah, so with the heavy metals such as nickel, tin, and lead, one of the things that was not discovered until much later on, more recently, was that with vapes, there's a coil inside that heats everything up and vaporizes it. Well, what they started to find was that coil breaks down over time. So you're essentially putting copper, tin, nickel, whatever that coil is made out of, or whatever those pieces that you screw into the glass piece that puts the juice in. So it may not even be nicotine. It could just be straight flavored juice. But now you're starting to put all that stuff into your lungs and you have no idea. So again, it was something that was interesting that this doctor brought up about cigarettes compared to vapes. Like, this is another thing people don't realize is, when that thing heats up to 500 degrees and vaporizes into your lung all these liquids, what else is going with it from that device that you're charging every single night and sucking in? So
And again, this is like what I like to stress to the teenagers is this idea that like your lungs are made of like 100,000 pockets. And it's these teeny little pockets that are 1 cell thick that when you breathe in, they expand open. It's like this magical thing that we have in our bodies. And to put any type of metal in there is not okay. And it's really harmful. And yeah, I mean, I think that it has a lot to do with even all the rest of this stuff. There's another one here.
Yeah.
Look at this. Look at this. Formaldehyde? What? I can't say these other names, so.
glycerin.
But I think that, the key here is this idea that oftentimes teenagers are like, what? It's just water vapor. Like, I think that they think, honestly, that, like, how you go into like a steam room or like you put on what are those? You're at the doctor and then they make you inhale on the steam thing.
Oh, yeah.
A nebulizer, thank you. I think that they think that this is a nebulizer, like that it's just water steam, but it's not.
I just think in general, and I'm not saying this about teens, I'm saying this about anybody really, like it's a not well thought out process. And I think some of this information, not to say that if you gave this presentation to teens, they would stop right away, but it definitely, you're planting that seed over time for sure.
All right, so why do they use sought after buzz? Nicotine only takes a few seconds to hit the brain. It increases dopamine and serotonin levels. It increases feelings of calm, relaxation. And it only lasts a few minutes, so the user will then experience fatigue and feeling down, which will then cause them to use again, right? So you guys know about this process. You take a hit, you feel good, you have energy, 2-3 minutes go by, and you're like, I need another hit to help me to feel that way again. I want to just shift the conversation over to THC vaping. Dab pens is what they're called often. Do you guys have any other questions or anybody want to jump in about the nicotine stuff?
Do kids still use chewing tobacco, or is that pretty much out of the realm, or is
That's
it
a great
more
question.
force-oriented depending?
I have treated probably about 300 teens, and I've had like 2 of them be into chewing tobacco, but it was more of a cultural thing, if you will. Yeah, more of like a team thing. So no, I don't think so.
So
Yes?
I was going to say, I think the thing that you brought up that was very interesting is sports, right? And I'm not pointing just at sports on this one, but I know that like as a freshman at O'Hara, I made the varsity team and I saw other seniors dipping in the locker room and I started to dip too. So I think that it's one of those things where you see somebody that you look up to. If that senior was vaping in the locker room, I might have tried to get a vape pen, you know what I mean? But I agree with you. I think it's very much present. I think it's still very much there. And when you asked that question, as Caroline was getting ready, I thought to myself, I don't think we've ever really looked into those numbers because it's so low in our space with what we're seeing. But I agree. I think it's very much present. I think it's very much still there.
I don't know the numbers wise, but my daughter has mentioned that there are kids that are doing it.
Yeah.
Because when you talk about formaldehyde and metals and glass, I mean, that's also part of what's in chewing tobacco
Yep.
as well.
Yeah. A lot of fiberglass in chewing tobacco. Yeah.
I mean, granted, you're metabolizing more in your stomach.
Sure.
It's into the bloodstream and not so much into the
Yeah.
lungs, but
It's interesting that we don't really talk about that
Yeah.
ever.
there is not a lot of talk about chewing
No,
tobacco.
there isn't. Yeah, there.
They back
Sure.
when we were little.
Well, we know scare tactics don't work, right? Like, I mean, yeah, we remember them, but like, do they really work and keep us away from things? It's like DARE. DARE never worked in school systems because it was the opposite of what we were trying to accomplish, which was to educate and inform teens, and then we were going in and telling teens not to do things.
Some of those commercials though with the cigarettes where they're pound of flesh for smoking, where they're tearing off their face or their teeth are falling out. I think some of those make more of an impression, but I don't know
Sure.
if they really think about that as they're smoking.
Right, right.
When they see it, it's like, oh, that's kind of gross.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so I find that, you know,
Do
the
you have a
big
question?
thing.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to quick say that I just find that the big thing with getting people to stop is just internal motivation. Like, so the teenagers, for example, we've been having a big problem at Center for Families with vaping. So we have 30 kids, and I had them all stand up, and then I said, you know, step into the circle if you've vaped. So then, like, you know, half of them stepped in. Step into the circle if you've vaped in this building. You know, I got like, you know, 10 stepped in. And then I'm like, you know, step in if you want to quit and you want to stop vaping, or at least start talking about stopping vaping. And I got like 70% of them, probably 7 stepped in. I got a couple that were like, no way, I'm never stopping, right? And I was like, okay, cool. But the other kids were, they wanted to stop. I mean, look, they weren't like, I'm ready to stop, but I was like, if I ran a group here for like an hour, would you guys show up to it? You know, and of course they're like, if I get out of school, I'm gonna go to it. And I'm like, okay. If I run a group here, will you guys show up? And they were like, yeah, we will. We'll show up and we'll talk about it. And I was like, I'm not gonna ask you to stop smoking or to stop vaping. I'm gonna ask you to just start talking about what is vaping doing for you and what is vaping hurting you? And how can we start to talk about slowing it down at least and not doing it every 5 minutes? So that's my personal opinion on how to go about stopping this stuff. Go ahead.
Are there any physical symptoms that you can avoid with kids? I mean, it feels like you're either going to find the device,
Yeah.
the wire, or whatever, and other than that, you're not going to know. I just remember like my mom, I wasn't smoking, I was with Jen, she was smoking.
Right.
That's why I quit smoking.
Yeah.
My mom grabbed my fingers and put them up to her nose and said, you were smoking.
That's good.
It's a smart mom.
You know what I mean? Is there anything?
So yeah, I mean, so there's nicotine urine drug screens.
Yeah.
So you
But
could
honestly,
give
the
it-
most likely way that I hear of parents like really screening things, it's the most random way, but I guess it happens all the time, is doing their laundry and finding pods in their pockets. They're so little, they always, I wouldn't say always, they forget sometimes. So, yeah. But yeah,
I
it's
mean,
it's
so
hard.
finding chargers, pods, vapes in their clothing and their stuff. You know, you can go looking through their stuff, but it's another option. But there is, you know, a way to tell if they're using nicotine. Okay, so cannabis, THC. So kids use THC in these vaporizing devices. They call it dab pens. And essentially the idea around THC is that it's the chemical that's responsible for the high that marijuana creates. And it also causes slowed reaction time, problems with balance, coordination, increased heart rate, appetite, problems with learning and memory and anxiety. We know that the more that teenagers smoke marijuana in adolescence, the more likely that their IQ is to drop. So there was a study that was done that looked at a lot of people. I think it looked at about 1,800 people, and they looked at what they called recurrent cannabis use, which was about smoking 3 or more times a week of marijuana. And they took IQ tests of these people when they were in 8th grade, meaning, you know, before they had used, and then looked at if they were recurring cannabis users throughout from like basically 14 to 18, then took their IQ test again, I think at 21 and 25, and found an average of 8-point drop. 8 points. That's like a lot. Now, of course, since then, there have been lots of studies that have come out to disprove this, especially fueled by the big marijuana industry. But I think that one of the things that we definitely do know is that it causes cognitive slowing, it causes memory issues, it causes balance issues, and we know that it really impacts the prefrontal cortex in their brains. So I always try and just tell parents that, number one, this is not the marijuana that you used to smoke, right? We know that, and we'll get into that a little bit. But number two, try and keep your kid's brain away from it for as long as possible.
One thing that's helpful to mention too, or talk about, if you have kids with ADHD, their brains are already compromised in the prefrontal in particular. So this is even slightly done that much more.
Yep.
We have an instance, he doesn't do it anymore, but he did it. My son tried it early on, like in the sophomore year, and that's exactly how we went at it. Was with that, it's like a concussion, but
Yep.
it takes that much longer for the repair time to happen.
Yeah.
That like hit home for him because he struggled with ADHD his whole life as well.
Yeah.
And as soon as he kind of like locked into that, it's like, so this should be full blood. Yeah, so you've been battling for 10 years since third grade knowing this and how hard it is for you to do the various things. I get it. How good it feels. And it was THC. Like there was THC oil with friends, I just happened to caught it in several rooms. That's kind of the instant. As soon as he kind of like understood that,
Yeah.
it's like kind of a vision.
Yeah.
He's an athlete and everything else, and it's just like still, it's kind of like,
Yeah.
Not everyone's going to turn like that.
No, but that's great. I mean, that's another great example of like education and information to make right decisions at an early age. And even if they're not going to take that bait and make the right decision right then and there, our job is to plant seeds along the way. So maybe they don't take it right away, but maybe that idea formulates into an actual theory that they kind of put in place later on, further on down the line.
Yeah, we're actually going to get a little bit more into that around like protective and risk factors, and we can use your son as an example. All right, so adolescent use of marijuana, typically there's problems with memory and learning, distorted perception, apathy, trouble with thinking and problem solving, increased risk of mental health. The mental health stuff is actually really important, especially around, co-occurring such as ADHD, specifically around psychosis. So marijuana, because of the fact that it is a hallucinogen, which we'll talk about, but typically what ends up happening is that if somebody has somebody who's schizophrenic in their family, who has struggled with that in the past, this marijuana can sometimes unlock that. So we see kids who essentially looked perfectly normal, were not hearing things or seeing things that were not there, and started, smoking habitually, and now they're hearing things and seeing things. And there is a lot of research surrounding this. And essentially what it looks at is this idea of kids that are coming in saying that they hear things and see things. Typically, schizophrenia does not show up until about 24. So seeing kids that are schizophrenic that are this young, they start really looking at their marijuana use and can kind of start to see that it can unlock it, which is kind of scary. Marijuana strength, like the strength of the amount of THC that's in it is leading more to addiction. And it's very unpredictable, the amount of THC, especially when you deal with edibles. One gummy could get you like completely blasted. So to think that like a kid found the gummy and then ate like 4 of them, like you're next level in a coma, knocked out, like not a real coma, guys, sorry. Yeah. Like a high coma.
Yeah. Yeah, but like to Caroline's point with edibles, a lot of times what we've seen or what we've heard and what we dealt with is that I took 1 gummy bear, it didn't really kick in. I took 2 or 3 more, and then next thing you know, it's like their concentrate level is through the roof. And just to back up to like dabs and oils as well, when we're talking about dabs and oils, this is also an unregulated market, so you're dealing with very high concentrated oils and dabs. So when they're smoking this stuff, they think that they're having fun, smoking a little THC. And we've had episodes of like psychosis from a direct result of hitting a vape pen that was 95% concentrate, but they didn't realize that because they used dad's PayPal account from China, and they just thought it was what they had at their friend's house last week. So, those are kind of things that, we like to look out for. And I know we're giving you guys all these scenarios, and it's really hard to like to your point, like how do I find this stuff? How do I know? But again, it goes back to more education and information, where to look, looking at the PayPal account. That's something I didn't even realize until we had that experience with that kiddo and that parent of, random charge on my PayPal account, should I be concerned? So, just things to notate, things to see, and things to look for.
All right, so mood altering substances tend to generally go into stimulant, depressant, or hallucinogen. Depressant, famously is alcohol, benzodiazepines, opiates. Stimulants would be things like meth and cocaine, and hallucinogens would be things like mushrooms and LSD and MDMA. Marijuana is a mixed action drug, so it can actually be a stimulant, depressant, or hallucinogen depending on the user. So it's just an interesting little fact. So some may feel paranoid or anxious or energized, some may feel chilled out and relaxed, and some may have an experience which causes them to disassociate from reality. Marijuana's use is much more, the current amount of marijuana, THC that's in marijuana is a lot different. So THC levels in the 60s and 70s with the flower that people would be smoking at like Woodstock or whatever, 1% THC. That's it, 1% THC. Then in the 80s and 90s came up to about 3%. Average THC level today in the flower of smoking of the actual THC is 13%, and the highest potency in the dried plant, again, is 30%, okay? So that's 30% with one hit, all right? Concentrates have much higher levels of THC, such as the gummies or the dab pens, and they can be up to 80%, which again, scary. Yes?
So if we look at Colorado and like Washington State that have had marijuana legalized, both recreational, what changes are they seeing in increase in driving accidents, emergency visits, kids overdosing, young kids overdosing?
Yeah.
Are they seeing increases that we just haven't seen here yet because we're newer to it?
Yeah.
And are they regretting their choice?
No, because it's creating tax dollars and revenue for their state. So we're not talking about those things. We're not experiencing the media coverage around those things. But interestingly enough, there was something online that was released yesterday that Colorado state as a whole correct me if I'm wrong here, DWIs just surpassed DUIs from last year for the first time since marijuana was legalized. So, yeah, I mean, they're just not talking about these things because of it's helping their budget and their billing and their revenue through the state. But, yeah, I mean, and again, it's still not a regulated industry, even though it's legalized. It's slightly regulated for tax purposes, but it's not. We're still seeing these high concentrates in dispensaries from California to Colorado to states that are legalizing it across the board.
And we had a slide about this, and I took it out just because, but I'm glad that we're talking about it. But first of all, in Colorado, the first person to die from THC happened. They took a bunch of edibles and then jumped out their window because they were hallucinating. So that happened a few years ago, about 5 years ago. And then I also know that there are an increased number of people that show up to the emergency room, which again, taxpayer dollars that we're all paying for, because they can't stop throwing up. So there's a type of, do you know what it's called? What is it called? Do you know what it's called? What's it called?
I don't know. I
Look up marijuana throwing up induced. It's essentially a syndrome that many people have come down with, in which when you smoke a very, very large amount, your body stops essentially accepting it. And you just continually are vomiting. And from there, the only thing that can stop these patients from vomiting is getting into a warm shower. I've seen about 2 or 3 kids with this type of syndrome. It's really scary. They can't keep anything down, and it's really, really tough. Go ahead. Were you going to say something? Okay.
What about like their unemployment rate? Is it increasing because you've got people who either have a lack of motivation to go out and get jobs, or they can't pass drug screens in order to get certain jobs?
don't know about that. I don't know anything about their unemployment rate.
We'll
I know
have
as a
to look
nation, our
that in.
unemployment rate's at an all-time low, but that's about all I can comment. It has nothing to do with marijuana.
I would say, yeah, I mean, the marijuana industry has created a lot of jobs. And a lot of jobs for people who were probably on disability or who were unemployed, smoking weed all day, and now get to smoke weed while picking the plants, right? So I don't think that I don't know if there's a correlation there, but we could look into it. Okay, so this kind of brings me to the end of the presentation around vulnerability. Like, why are some people addicted? Why are other people not? You know, do I know if I know that my kid is using, how do I know whether or not they are, you know, really going to become addicted? So the answer is, number one, genetics. So there's a lot of research around this idea. I can list you a lot of different statistics that have come out of a lot of different studies over the years, but the one that I stick onto the most is that if one person in your family struggles with addiction, you're 4 times more likely to struggle with addiction. So just keep that in mind. It could, by the way, be a cousin, it could be an uncle, it could be a great-great-grandfather. It's just one person in the family. And then your risk just sort of got a little bit bigger and bigger the closer that they get to you. 2, psychosocial. So this has to do with the idea of diagnoses in your own life, you know, experiencing depression, anxiety, issues, any type of medical issues early on in life. And then 3 is environmental. So the idea, you know, ADHD, for example, having a struggle in school, right? That could lead to feelings of inadequacy, which could then lead you to a person who, you know, kids that are having fun and are drinking at a party, and you want to feel that sense of belongingness because you felt so inadequate when you were a teenager or when you were a child and in school and struggling. So these are the kinds of things that we have to look at that can all help us to understand. But the thing that to really remember is this idea of age of onset of use. And the idea is that the longer that we can keep their little fragile brains away from substances and mind and mood altering substances, the more likely that we are to be able to have a kid that is normal and functioning and a, you know, successful member of society. So typically whenever I'm talking to parents about this idea, I always have parents that ask me a question. This is what's going on with my kid. They did this, this, and this. What do I do? I don't know. Like, are they going to be struggling for the rest of their lives? Are they going to have to live in my basement? Am I going to have to send them to treatment? And my answer to them is that I want them to think of their kid as a block of Swiss cheese, which, you know, they don't really get initially, but I'll explain it. So teenagers are essentially 1,000 pieces of Swiss cheese, all right, put together. And the idea is that if we look at one slice of Swiss cheese, right, and we look at the holes, okay, and we said that those holes are risk factors. All right, well, what are risk factors? Risk factors are low socioeconomic status, okay, living in a violent neighborhood or community, dealing with emotional stress at home, like domestic violence or a divorce or a separation or fighting in the home, dealing with a sibling who has some kind of a disability, struggling with, you know, not having strong relationships with teachers or coaches, all right? Not having a passion for something that they really love. So I could go on and on, okay? Thousands and thousands of risk factors, right? That would create these holes in these pieces of Swiss cheese. And then the pieces of the cheese, right, around the holes would be your protective factor. So a great protective factor is this dad sitting right here who said to his son, listen, dude, you can't be smoking weed because it's gonna really mess up your brain and it's like a concussion and you just gotta stop doing it, all right? We're just gonna talk it through and now here he is and he has a better understanding through your guidance and mentorship of him as your son. So that would be a protective factor, right? An open and loving, caring relationship with one parent that they feel comfortable going to and being vulnerable with, right? Protective factors are things like being able to have resources to get the treatment that they need, trying to, coming from a home that is filled with love and is a low stress environment, proper nutrition being given to them every day. We can go on and on.
Sleep.
Yeah, having good sleep, sleep hygiene,
teens.
right?
Yeah.
There are so many protective factors that we can talk about. And they can be so little, right? Like having a dog that they feel really attached to and connected to. Like that could be a little protective factor. And for whatever reason, there are certain kids that like end up at Center for Families, that the way in which the Swiss cheese stacked up, there was just a hole that went straight down. For whatever reason, nobody's fault, they had a lot of risk factors and they just went right over each other. And the protective factors just did not cover them, right? And then there's certain kids who have these risk factors and the protective factors, cover them up, which is what it sounds like happened to your son, which is that he had this risk factor of ADHD, a diagnosis early on in life, which can really alter the way that you perceive yourself, the way that you perceive the academic system. And he decided to try marijuana, and you, as the father, was a protective factor, and same with, sounds like he's pretty mature, he can think things through, etc. That would be another protective factor that just kind of covered that little thing up, right? But it's nobody's fault if just for whatever reason, these things stacked up that there was just a hole that went straight down. I'm one of the kids that the hole went straight down when I was a teenager, right? I had all sorts of really great protective factors and all sorts of risk factors, and for whatever reason, I ended up in lots of treatment, okay? And so, again, it's nobody's fault that my protective factors just didn't really cover up my risk factors. That's okay. But what we have to do is we have to see it, right? And so the big question for you guys is gonna be this idea of like, how can I tell whether or not my kid has a hole that's going straight down and I need to tend to it? And yeah, the answer is really this idea of, did anything change recently? Like the big warning sign, right, is they are acting really differently. They used to have a lot of friends and now they have no friends. They used to have no friends, now they have a lot of friends. They used to be really unreactive and now they're really reactive. They used to, sit in their room all day and be in Netflix and now they're out all the time. Those are some of the things that you guys have to really start looking at as parents. I think that I always tell parents, go with your gut. You know your kid the best, and you're the one that lives with them all day, every day. If you feel like something's off, get them assessed. Bring them in somewhere, get them assessed with a professional. It never hurts to do that. We live in a world where you can call the back of your insurance card, say, I'm worried about my kid, I need to get them an assessment. Can you put me in the right direction? Boom, done.
Yeah.
We're so lucky to live in this first world country that can allow us that space and time to be able to go and do that. But I always just say to parents, go with your gut, and any major changes that are worrying you, get them in. Get them in to see a professional. And oftentimes, there are a lot of times where kids come in for Center for Families. We do assessments all the time where a kid comes in, the parent's like, I'm really worried about them. I do the full assessment, and I'm like, there's not really much to worry about. Could they use therapy once a week to talk about some issues that normal teenagers go through? Sure, yeah, let's set them up. But do they really need it right now? Not necessarily. And other times parents bring them in and say, I have a really intense feeling that my kid is really struggling. And we bring them in and we find out that, yeah, they are really struggling. They're thinking about suicide, or they're vaping a lot, or they want to stop smoking weed, or they're struggling with peer relationships. And that's okay too.
Yeah.
It's just a hole. Okay, how's that? Question?
Good job.
Yeah.
There you go. Perfect.
These are some risk factors and some protective factors that we had on here that will help you guys. Go ahead.
What measures have you seen schools taking to eliminate the use, or at least try to prevent the use of vaping in school?
Yeah, I think that
my understanding is that there are signs. There's posters that says no vaping. I can tell you that at Center for Families, we do a don't ask, don't tell policy where if a kid hands in their vape in the morning, we'll give it back to them in the afternoon. And when they leave, they're in programming with us for 10 hours. So the idea would be that they've now gone 10 hours without their vape, which is a really big deal for them. And we will then introduce the idea in therapy with their parents that they have this vape and that we're working towards this, et cetera, make it a therapeutic issue. There's a lot of suspensions.
So I guess my question to you is, what do you think the schools can do?
That's what I don't know.
Because what I'm hearing from teachers and faculty is very difficult because they look like flesh wraps, a lot of them.
And they're
They don't
odorless.
even know, and they're odorless, and they're hard to detect.
Yeah.
So,
Short of staffing the bathrooms,
right. And even then,
Right, they can go in the stall and.
I suggested I look at vaping clothes. I mean,
So one of the things that they did at a treatment program that I know of that does eating disorders is you sing Yankee Doodle when you're in the bathroom so that you're not throwing up a half an hour after you eat. Wow. So I had this whole idea that like when teenagers go to the bathroom at Center for Families, I'll just have them like sing, but then I realized it could just be like, Yankee Doodle comes to town, riding on a, like, it'd be very easy to vape while singing Yankee Doodle. So,
Listen, we can put posters.
Working on getting your danger level in the curriculum.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that.
A lot of it.
I think it's, yeah.
Yeah. Information side, it's kind of the anti, what's happening, but kind of like, it's just what's bringing back recently is there's a program on Netflix called Broken. It's all about different industries.
Is that what you were talking about?
There's one individual segment on there, it's all about
vaping.
more around Joule.
Yeah.
How the rise of it and how cigarette companies actually have taken the position of trying to desensitize people to smoking because they own the fuel industry.
Yep.
They own the vaping
Yeah.
industry also. So it's that increase that. So they're not losing it all.
Sure.
Right? Just kind of like even the cigarette piece, they decrease the sale price, but they're increasing it.
Yep.
The schools, they're doing the same thing. They're flooding money into schools to try to, but it's really a PS. Right? But schools, to your point, there's an administrator on there. He's talking about. He said we're confident that over 75% of our students are children.
Yep.
And he said he's like we can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
It's constant suspensions. Right?
Yeah, and then there's also.
What? Because that's not stopping it.
Yeah.
They're talking about therapeutic programs like in schools for them. It's
Yeah.
I know that a local school district started up a vaping group where kids come and talk about vaping.
Well, and I think there are a lot of different angles to approach it from
Right. That's what I was gonna say.
like early intervention, education,
Yep.
and psychoeducational awareness, and back cessation programs, and things of that nature. I think what's hard is, to your point, like there's like the punitive side of it.
That's- yeah.
We want to try and be preventative and try and increase awareness and kind of impart that knowledge upon kids, especially before it becomes so big. But it's very cyclical. It's challenging to get your arms fully around.
Yeah, and then there's also some legal restraints on districts too. I've just been working with Springfield School District in Delaware County in regards to bringing programming in there, and they talk all the time about like we can't take these things from them. We're legally not allowed to do that. So I think there's legal restraints, there's issues, but to your point, I think the only way is to get upstream with preventative measures and really try to educate and inform our youth about their decision-making process. You brought a great example tonight, talking to your son, just having that little conversation changed his entire direction, right? So if we can do that more often, I think we'll have greater success over a longer period of time. Is it going to stop everybody from doing it? No. And this is a very tough issue. I mean, to your point, big tobacco really found out a way to capitalize when they were going kind of downhill a little bit. So it's a tough issue, but all we can do is try to stay in front of it, try to be preventative, try to be informative, and try to allow our teens to make better decisions throughout that process.
And I will say that there's hope, not based on data, but based on my own anecdotal data, which is that we have recently admitted a few 13-year-olds and they don't vape and don't intend to vape and think that it's stupid. And I have also 2 nephews that are also 13, so 7th and 8th graders. And we had a 6th grader too. When you talk to them about it, they're like, I don't want to be gasping for breath. I swear that whole situation with that kid, with that video of him gasping for breath, which is terrifying. I don't know if anybody saw it, but it's literally hard. Like it's one of those like scare tactics that I actually think work, because it's horrifying to think. Like the scariest thing that anybody can ever go through is not feeling like they can't breathe. That's the worst way to die. And, I guess that the idea was that when I was talking to them about it, they were just like, yeah, no. I was like, have you ever tried it? They're like, yeah, it's just stupid. It makes me lightheaded. I'm like, okay. So I do kind of think that some of the stuff around the media, around the popcorn lung, and this is what my lungs look like, and all that has actually gone down a little bit to the little siblings.
And once we get a hold on this, it'll be something else, right? So,
Yeah.
I mean, it's always going to be something. And that's not to defray the hope that was just provided, but more or less just to say that, we can only work so hard, educate so much, and really try to be present in the situation in the eye of the storm. So thank you all for coming, though. We really appreciate it. And,
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, sir.
Where was that video?
It's all
Type
over.
type teen gasping for breath vaping.
It's terrible.
And you will find it. It's a kid in out west.
It's on YouTube.
Colorado,
It'll
maybe?
come right up as soon as you pop it into YouTube. Yeah,
No problem. Oh, yeah, no.
yeah, absolutely.
I just one more.
Yeah.
And this is, I just want your opinion, because I assume you give this talk at other school districts.
Yeah.
I personally feel that this event was marketed very well, emails, Facebook, et cetera. Why do you think there's only 12 people here?
Do you want to know why?
Yeah.
Are you sure?
Yes.
Because I think that parents are vaping.
You think that they don't want to come here and hear all of this?
Yeah. I think that there's like a lot of parents that are like 30 and 40 and were smoking and started vaping, and it's like 1,000 times better, and that's why. That's why?
I think people are just busy, they're going to gymnastics.
Well, and busy, and I also think that, it's not my child. You know what I mean? This idea that, not my kid, it's not going to happen. Maybe your kid, but not my kid. And I only say that because Caroline knows I work at Center for Families, but I started a nonprofit like 3.5 years ago in my hometown. And we started doing more work with the education system. And when we first started in Springfield High School, we had like 170 parents come out just because they weren't sure as to who we were. And then as soon as they found out we were tackling the issue of substance use disorder, we had like non-existent attendance at town hall meetings from there on out. So, I think it's this idea that it's not my kid, not here. Now, I will say kudos to Downingtown for live streaming, because what we found with our events was that maybe parents don't want to be present and sit in that room, but they will watch it online, because we started to live stream a lot of our nonprofit events, and our attendance skyrocketed. So.
We had a total of 31 during the live.
Dropping in.
But that's the point.
That was,
They can watch it at their convenience.
in fact, it'll probably go up to 300.
I was
Yeah.
knowing in Sophia, they had somebody at West High School last year, and it said 2,400. And it wasn't about a different subject.
Yeah, but I agree. It's convenience in their own home. If they have to go to gymnastics, or if that's what's going on, or making dinner, or they just got home from work, they can watch it when they need to, when they want to. But kudos to everybody here for making the effort to come out. And, I hope we can create a small impact on a large issue.
I'll say too that I do a talk on isolation, the new drug of choice, and the image on it is teenagers laying in bed on their phones. And that brings out 100, 150, 200 people to each talk that I'm doing for that. That's bringing out a lot of parents, because they want to talk about their teens being on their phones all day and all night, and not going out and not going to parties like they used to.
I mean, this is helpful to me because I have a 3rd grader and a 6th grader.
Yeah.
And I feel
God,
like
that's
there's
awesome.
More education in Downingtown about this stuff than I am. So I was like, well, I guess I better figure out what it is.
That's good.
Learning, like my 3rd grader just started health today, and she came home and she was like, we just started talking about drugs and alcohol.
Good.
And I was like, what did they tell you?
Yeah. Right?
I was in a 4th grade classroom fixing something, and they were saying the same thing, and I was like, whoa, 4th grade, but like,
Yep.
absolutely.
But that's the time we have to start. We have to start there. See, the big mistake that was made, even in the eye of the epidemic, was that we were starting in 12th grade. Well, guess what? Like, we're way behind the curve. You're not going to tell them anything they don't know. Then we were like, all right, 11th grade, 10th grade. But really, it's 4th, 5th, 6th grade, because by the time they're in 8th grade, now they're looking for acceptance from their peers, and they're ready to make decisions. I mean, they think they're ready to make decisions, right? So it's getting them before that cement dries, and it's getting them.
What they're trying to do.
No, DARE tried to scare people. DARE went into the school systems and said, don't do this, right? Instead of empowering the teens' decision-making process, they told you what to do. And really, DARE was created for the 1 in 4 kids that might be exposed to substance use disorder. And what it did was it turned on this thing in teens' minds where the other 3 and 4 were curious about all the drugs that they just talked about. And they were doing it with a uniformed police officer, which is like the worst human being. No offense to police officers that are uniformed, but we we have to educate and inform from a perspective of having a conversation. Yeah. Sorry, I apologize. I get really hyped up about that. Sorry.
It's like even when they did the education around cigarettes, when you think about like, when my kids were really little, I remember them sitting in their car, they were tiny.
Yeah.
And they were talking about how gross cigarettes were, and I'm thinking, why would you talk about this? And I'm like, why would you just address everything else?
Right.
And it is getting lower and lower and lower.
It's good.
Which is-
We're finally getting there. Yeah.
Those big parents are talking about like why there's only so many people in here. I teach both in the district, not far from here. We talk about, I'm doing mental health screening.
Yeah.
And we have over 1,000 kids in middle school. And the response, less than 100 for a screening.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, everyone's talking about, I want my kid this, I want my kid that, I want my kid that. I'm like, I'm never going to do this.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it goes back to like, well, not my kid, or I'm afraid of
Right.
that, or afraid of finding out. There's so many reasons.
Yeah.
Just to go back to the kindergarten and to 5th grade, it's something that you might want to think about doing. Be a part of the conversation. Does a kindergarten to 5th grade program called Have You Had the Conversation? And it literally brings out parents of 1st graders that come out, and essentially she talks to them about this idea of like, when you give your kid medication, right? Saying like, so this is medication, it was prescribed by the doctor. It's going to make you feel better, but not all medication makes you feel better necessarily. We're only gonna give you the dose that was prescribed by your doctor. That so like you have to think like, what are the messages that they're getting around pills and around medication? Like, this is something that's gonna make me better. That's the thing. Like, so you have to kind of be like, yes, it's gonna make your symptoms feel better, but it doesn't make you better because it's just helping the symptoms. Your flu is still there. Like, helping to kind of understand this idea. She also talks about this idea of like, kids hear you come home and be like, oh, I had such a hard day at work, I need a glass of wine, right? And like how to change that thought, like that idea that like you need a glass of wine, like do you need it? And yeah, so she just does all these sorts of—
Unbelievable job.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even like to the point where like taking a 3rd or 4th grader, if they have a headache, and showing them exactly on the back of the Advil bottle, like we take 2 because we're in this age bracket and no more, you know what I mean? So it's very informative, and it's a great way to kind of segue into making sure we're having that conversation or starting to have that conversation.
I think parents are also, especially parents of young kids, are very afraid of those conversations. Because I've brought up in some meetings that I go to, the idea of it's good to come now before your kids are having these problems.
Absolutely.
So that you're either able to kind of head it off at the pass, or you're catching it early.
Yeah.
Get some kind of resource under your belt for when it does happen.
Yep.
But a lot of parents of young kids don't want to hear that.
Right.
They don't want that door open.
Yeah.
You want to normalize it, you want to make it a conversation that the child feels
Comfortable saying, I'm struggling, I need something.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And listen, that's always the issue of trying to get parents to come out to those things and be proactive instead of reactive in the moment or in the crisis. Because if we're being reactive, you know, it's very tough for families to deal with those situations.
And then there's a time lag.
Yeah.
Because although you may have the number on the back of your insurance card for resources, it doesn't mean those resources are available to you.
Oh, yeah.
In the time frame that you want them or you think you need them.
Yeah.
It can take a while to get in to see a screening, or to make an appointment with a therapist, or to get a regular appointment with a therapist.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially right here in Chester County, we just had, unfortunately, like 4 or 5 child psychiatrists. One like had a heart attack, one passed away. Like we lost a bunch of them, and people are waiting like 3 or 4 months now to get an assessment, which was kind of regular, but now it's becoming more the norm. So to your point, yeah, those things are, it's very important that we be proactive. To Caroline's point, if you see something or you're feeling something, it doesn't hurt to maybe start that process of even having a 3rd-party therapist in the room to talk about some of these issues and help open them up, or you know, to have the resources like be a part of the conversation. Have you had the conversation, and really getting yourself educated on how to have that conversation with your little one, your tween, your teen, whatever age group they may be in. Cool. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone.
Guys.
Yeah.
When I asked her, so why didn't you start talking about today? She's like, well, they said stuff about medications,
Yeah,
And
the
that
screening is like my next task.
you're only supposed to take a certain amount.